Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Fast Forward Expert Roundtable this morning regarding entry-level driver training for the trucking industry. Just a couple of quick introductions here as we get underway and as we're have you guys join us and log in. My name is Craig Hart. I'm with Vertical Alliance Group. I am part of our events team here, so you have probably seen me on previous webinars if you've participated in those with us before. And my background is in distance learning. That's how I entered this world with you all. Oops. And with me today is my co-host, as always, Mr. Mark Ray. And Mark is one of you. He is a former trucking executive with over 35 years experience in the industry. He is now, I don't want to say you've retired from an active role, because I know you actually remain probably more active now than you were when you were working with Frozen Food Express, as you're still involved consulting with organizations both within and without the transportation industry about the future of our industry. So Mark, it's always great to have you with us, sir. Hope you had a wonderful holiday and a happy new year.
I did. Thank you very much. And today's January the 5th, 2022, and this date, February 7th, 2022, that Jeremy will detail shortly, has been on a lot of people's schedule of things to get done for a long time. So I'm really looking forward to listening to Jeremy and the thousands of hours that he and his team have invested putting together a professionally based ELDT program, the long-awaited ELDT program.
Long-awaited, multi-year delayed ELDT program. So before I bring Jeremy on, I just want to mention that this actually is an additional session about this for the folks that we work with and other trucking companies out there. We did a session back in November that was very well attended, but we know not everybody could attend that first session. So we wanted to hold a second one for those that were not able to make the first one. And we also have some additional information this time around on some questions that we had from our previous session that we wanted to address that Jeremy will get to as we're going through this. But our speaker today with us is Jeremy Rose. Jeremy is the video production manager here at Vertical Alliance Group. He has been with us for many, many, many years. Some of you, if you have taken our training in the past, you will recognize his voice, as he has also been the voiceover talent for some of our videos as well, and is responsible for keeping the team of folks that put our content together, that roll it out new, or in the case of ELDT, revamping it from the original specs that were published. He's the one that's responsible for all that, and he's had to live with this project pretty intensely now for the last 6 months or so. And I'm sure he will be very happy when February 7th rolls around and this finally goes live and he can look at some other content than this. So Jeremy, good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Now, before we get underway, there are going to be things that we talk about today that you might want to take a little bit of a deeper dive on, and you have some questions about our platform that we're not going to necessarily address on our presentation today. That's fine. We can always set up a after call little demo with you. It takes 25, 30 minutes. We can walk you through the specifics of where ELDT will be located in the catalog, show you the functionality, how you can assign it, the reporting that's available for it, and so forth. To get that set up, you can just contact Woody Odell. Phone number there at the bottom of the screen, 866-905-5087, or you can email Woody at woody.odell@verticalag.com, and he will reach back out to you and figure out what's a good time for you guys to visit. So, all right. So the new driver process. CDL application, commercial learner's permit, entry-level driver training right smack dab in the middle there, followed by the skills training test and obtaining the CDL from the state. So we're going to focus on this middle box today. These other parts of the process, some of them are not changing. Obviously, the first two boxes are the same. The skills training and skills test, that is the behind the wheel training. That's not something that we will facilitate as a theory content provider on our end. And then obtaining the CDL from the state, that is the same as before. But we're going to focus on this theory content portion. And with that, Jeremy, we'll let you take it away.
Thanks very much. So just to reiterate, my name is Jeremy Rose. I am the video production manager for Vertical Alliance Group, or Infinit-I Workforce Solutions. And today we're going to talk about entry-level driver training. So these are the new requirements from the FMCSA. Please note that this presentation is designed for those that have little to no prior knowledge about entry-level driver training, what it is or why it's important. If you're already familiar with the new regulations, then most of this information will not be new to you, but we are going to have a Q&A at the end of this. So if you have any particular questions, feel free to ask them then. There's a lot of specific information to cover in these new regulations, more than we have time to go over here. If your question is not answered, again, please ask during the Q&A. Or if you're the type that likes to get your hands dirty, or you just like to brush up on things afterwards, all of this information is available online in the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations at www.ecfr.gov, specifically under Title 49, Part 380, Special Training Requirements. You can also find more information about the Training Provider Registry, which we will discuss at length during this presentation, at www.tpr.fmcsa.dot.gov. This presentation will focus on general entry-level driver training information, as well as specific information for Class A, Class B, as well as the H endorsement. So let's go ahead and jump into things. Next slide, please. What is entry-level driver training? Beginning February 7th, 2022, entry-level drivers will be subject to the requirements in the entry-level driver training, or ELDT, regulations. The whole purpose of this is to set a minimum standard of training requirements for entry-level CDL holders. These regulations are established by the FMCSA. Next slide, please. Who does this apply to? These new regulations apply to drivers obtaining a Class A or Class B CDL for the first time, upgrading an existing Class B CDL to a Class A CDL, or obtaining a school bus S, passenger P, or hazardous materials H endorsement for the first time. The key point there is that whole for the first time situation. Next slide, please.
Jeremy, I noticed you didn't, renewals are not applied if you are renewing your CDL?
Nope, absolutely not.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So what about current CDL holders, right? The ELDT regulations are not retroactive, meaning that the entry-level driver training requirements do not apply to individuals holding a valid CDL or an SP or H endorsement issued prior to February 7th, 2022. If an applicant who obtains a commercial learner's permit prior to February 7th, 2022 obtains a CDL before that CLP or renewed CLP expires, then the applicant is also not subject to the ELDT requirements. Basically meaning if you're good to go before February 7th, which we're coming up on, then you're going to be good to go for the rest of this. This is all really stuff that applies to new drivers after February 7th. Next slide, please. All right, so what's the point, right? The ELDT regulations establish a federal standard for training CDL applicants. Applicants must successfully complete this training before they will be permitted to take the CDL skills test, or in the case of the H endorsement, the knowledge test. This means that all new entry-level drivers should have roughly the same amount of training when they take their CDL or endorsement tests. The desire here is to prevent untrained individuals from obtaining a CDL or endorsement, and to make sure that all entry-level drivers meet the necessary basic threshold to safely operate a commercial motor vehicle. Next slide, please. Now that we know who is affected by the ELDT regulations, let's talk a little bit about what the training actually looks like. There is no federally mandated amount of training time that a driver trainee must complete for entry-level driver training. The FMCSA only requires that training cover all topics set forth by the FMCSA. The required topics are broken into two sections, theory and behind the wheel. Behind the wheel is broken into two further sections, range and public road. As a note, Infinit-I Workforce Solutions as a platform only handles online training. So I'll only be covering the theory portion of the training here. But if you have questions about the behind the wheel training, please do ask me in the Q&A section. Next slide, please. Are there different requirements? The ELDT regulations are the same for Class A and B, as well as S, P, and H endorsements. There are no special regulations that must be followed for the different classes or endorsements outside of the different topics that must be covered. For clarity, what I mean by this is that there's nothing that you have to do as far as ELDT regulations go to get your Class B compared to getting your Class A, other than the topics that you must train on being slightly different. No class or endorsement has a hidden specific amount of time or otherwise differing requirements. There's just different topics for each different class or endorsement. Depending on the class of CDL or endorsement a driver trainee is trying to obtain and the differing processes that they go through, it is feasible that a driver trainee might be trained on the same topic multiple times. For example, training on railroad crossings is required for Class A, as well as Class B, as well as H endorsement. So a driver might theoretically need to be trained on that topic 3 different times in relatively rapid succession, depending on when they attempt to obtain or upgrade their CDL. Basically, if a driver came in as getting a Class B CDL, they go through the ELDT training there. Then they go for a Class A a little later on. They go through the ELDT training there as well, and then H endorsement again down the road, right? So keep that in mind, right? Like as you go into these, as you are training these drivers, make sure you're training them for the right thing at the right time, okay? Next slide, please. Remember, there is no required time amount for entry-level driver training. You just have to cover all of the topics set forth by the FMCSA for each class or endorsement. The FMCSA has established 30 training topics for Class A, 29 training topics for Class B, and 13 training topics for the hazardous materials endorsement. As I said earlier, Infinit-I Workforce Solutions is only a theory training provider, so I won't cover the behind the wheel topics in depth, but just as a heads up, there are 19 topics for Class A, 18 for Class B, and there is no behind the wheel portion for the H endorsement. As a note, while there are no time requirements for any of the classes or endorsements, driver trainees must receive an overall minimum score of an 80% on the theory assessment portion for entry-level driver training. Next slide, please. All right, so what are the topics? I won't read through all of these, but we'll leave them on screen for a brief moment. Once again, all of this information is on the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations website at www.ecfr.gov. The sections for Class A are basic operation, safe operating procedures, advanced operating practices, vehicle systems and reporting malfunctions, and non-driving activities. Please note that if you are interested in researching the information yourself, the FMCSA has listed each of these topics with a prompt explaining the minimum information that must be covered by each topic. That's too much information to cover in this presentation, but if you have questions about a specific topic, please let me know during the Q&A. Next slide,
I would like to point out here, when we're talking about topics, it's possible due to the breadth of the information that is being covered in some of these that there might be more than one course assigned to a specific topic. So it's not one for one necessarily when we're talking about 30 total topics. It's not 30 pieces of training content. It may be more depending on what subject matter has to be covered. When we're looking at our library, Jeremy, we try and keep our courses in that 3 to 8 minute sweet spot. For information retention, I know, but this would give a rough approximation. By that time frame times this number of topics, it's going to be roughly equivalent. So again, there's no time limit requirements, not 40 hours that have to be trained. It's basically how quickly can the student driver get through this information successfully with that minimum score.
Yeah, and that key
then they're
point
done.
there is successfully, right? Like, as long as they can pass the testing requirements, you know, they're good to go. And that's a very good point about the topics not necessarily equating to being a one-to-one for videos. I think pre-trip is a great example of this, right? We all know how long a good, real, valid pre-trip takes. And trying to cover all of that type of information in a single 5 to 8 minute video is, you know, it's not really possible. So for those types of topics, right, we'll probably have breakout videos. Not probably, we do have breakout videos where we'll have a couple of different videos covering that particular topic. So the way that we're going to be formulating that for our system is actually going to follow the unit schematics that the FMCSA has published. So for each of these classes, for example, Class A, the FMCSA has a unit code, which is A for Class A since it's the first one they published. So it'll be like Unit A1-01 for orientation, for example. So we're going to follow the same classification or the same categorization for our content so that it's very easy to follow. And if you're ever looking anything up on the FMCSA or the ECFR, basically, you'll be able to see an almost one-for-one comparison. The only differentiation you'll see is when we have multiple topic or multiple videos to cover a single topic, basically.
That's a good, I want to show people that just because I think some folks may have been a little bit confused by that. And I do have an example of that pulled up that I can show everyone. We're going to try and follow that same nomenclature that the state uses because we want your people to be able to track back specific training modules the same way. So that D101 or D102, it also makes it very easy for you as the manager to go, okay, what's next in this order of the sequence? If you're, for example, doing multiple training sessions with a driver and you don't have all of them, because with 30 topics, you're probably not going to want to have all of those go out to a single driver at one time. That'll probably be overwhelming, but you might want to break them up into thirds and then send out 3 different groups, and this will help you keep track of and make sure that the sequencing is the correct so that it covers everything on these lists. So I'm not finding that.
Yeah.
I thought I had that link pulled up on my screen, but it's not giving me the
Our
option
intent is to make this as seamless a process as we can for anyone that utilizes our system for it, obviously.
Is there a mandated sequence, or is it just
no? There's no mandated sequence. There is the sequence that they release the content topics in, right? That specific order, and that order does follow a somewhat logical path. As you can see, right, the section 1 basic operation covers the basics that you would need to know, and then it kind of moves into other potential topics. But there's no requirement by the FMCSA to do anything in a specific order. You just have to cover all of the topics.
Gotcha.
The order that we're going to follow, though, in terms of how we label things will be the way they're going from section 1 to 5. And then we'll also,
Absolutely.
I know we break down in some of those sections that have multiple videos for it. For example, the pre-trip, post-trip, there'll be a 1-10A and a 1-10B so that you guys can eyeball very quickly which are included with which group. So.
And then again, if that's not your cup of tea and you don't particularly care, my understanding in communication with our client success team is that they just intend on setting this all up via templates so that you can just press a button and go, hey, it's all assigned, done.
Yeah. So and that's something that can be talked about in the demo that we talked about earlier. Sure. So, but as you can also see very easily, if you are trying to do this and go this alone and be your own theory content provider, these are the subjects you need to build content on. As Jeremy will tell you, it's not something you can do overnight. So if that's the route you want to go, I hope you started already because it does take work and effort and time to cover things thoroughly in the right manner. But this is one of the reasons that we wanted to get this information in front of you is so if you look at this list and find this very daunting, we understand that. And that's why this sort of content is available to all the clients that we work with. Will be turned on automatically in the library as its own little separate cutout, so you know very easily how to find that. Mm-hmm. All right. Do we want to move on the next one here?
Yeah, next slide whenever you're ready. Yep.
Sure.
So these are the topics for Class B. Once again, I'm not going to read through all of these, but we will leave them on the screen briefly. The eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that the Class B topics look suspiciously similar to the Class A topics. That's because they are. The only topic difference between Class A and Class B is the coupling and uncoupling topic in Section 1 for Class A, not being required for Class B. Next slide, please. And here are the hazardous materials endorsement topics. The vast majority of all of this stuff is pretty standard stuff. Again, it's meant to be. The FMCSA's goal here isn't to reinvent the wheel. It's just to standardize the training it takes to get behind one. Most of this type of training you're probably already providing, not necessarily from an entry-level standpoint, but just from a basic techniques and safety practices kind of standpoint for your drivers. So there is that. If you are trying to go at your own and produce your own content, keep that in mind, right? But even if you are or have produced your own ELDT content in the past for the prior regulations, a lot of this content is still the same content, right? So it's just a matter of formulating it and making sure that you have all of your I's dotted and T's crossed. So next slide, please.
One thing I want to touch on very briefly, because we do have some folks on the call today that potentially have never seen how we format our training materials, is that they are primarily video and then have a multiple choice quiz at the end of it. Usually for a 5 to 8 minute video, it's less than 10 questions and multiple choice, and it can be taken repeatedly so that if a driver is not successful the first time, they can go back and take it again and again, potentially, if they need to, until they are able to pass. And that way we're able to track the progress, both of how much time is being spent watching the video, because we do require people to go all the way through the video at least one time before they're allowed to take the quiz. And that way, on a training record, it will show that for an 8-minute video, they spent 8 minutes of time watching that. What we don't want training records to show is, hey, this is an 8-minute video and your driver spent 30 seconds watching it, because God forbid that driver become involved in an accident at a later date. That's not going to hold up into anyone's inspection if they put that in front of a jury at a trial. Same thing with the quiz questions. We keep those separate from the material so that it's not easy for the driver to immediately go back and reference it against what they just read. They do have to pay attention. And again, it's all about the integrity of the reporting so that no one can question what's happening in the system when they're going through our training material. They are doing the work, they are getting the scores, and those things are legitimate. So again, those are things we can show you examples of how those are structured in that demo if that's something that you'd like to participate in. All right. Ready for the next slide, Jeremy?
Yes, sir.
Awesome.
So after all of that information, how do you actually get training? The short answer is that you either find a training provider or you become one. But this is where things can get a little more complicated. In order to monitor and regulate these new requirements, the FMCSA has created the Training Provider Registry. Training providers for entry-level driver training must be listed on the Training Provider Registry. And yes, that includes you if you are training your own driver trainees to obtain their CDL or an endorsement. Becoming an approved training provider requires submitting an electronic application to the Training Provider Registry, self-certifying that you meet all ELDT requirements, affirming under penalty of perjury that you will only teach the prescribed ELDT curriculum. And for clarity on that, it means you're not going to teach anything contrary to what this FMCSA has requested, right? If you cover more topics than what the FMCSA has listed, that's fine. It's just if what you teach is contrary to what the FMCSA has required, then that's a problem. And then the final requirement is maintaining documentation proving ELDT compliance in the event of an audit. Once a training provider has been accepted to the TPR, they'll be assigned a unique training provider ID number, which will appear on a driver trainee's record in the Commercial Driver's License Information System. Next slide, please. So registering to become a training provider is actually a very simple process. You just go to tpr.fmcsa.dot.gov. You click on the training providers tab, you click on register now, and from there you just follow the registration instructions. Basic information that you'll need on hand is your contact information, information for your company and organization like contact information, address, etc., and then any relevant affiliations for your company like your DOT numbers or whether or not you're part of some state associations or the CVSA or something like that, right? After that, you will enter a waiting period where the FMCSA must approve your registration request. And this must be done before you can register training locations or invite additional users to the TPR on your behalf. Now, this waiting period is not an especially long time, but it is a manual process to my understanding. So if you have not already done this and you need to do it, then you probably need to go ahead and do it now, as my assumption would be anyone who hasn't done it and needs to get it done, there might be a rush between now and the deadline for February 7th. So,
Mark, you and I were talking about this before the call. Everyone on the call probably remembers the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse and how, quote unquote, smoothly that went the first month it went live. And it was a nightmare. And it probably impacted some of you negatively. And it was because there was a bottleneck of registrations, people that waited until the last minute to get involved. There is the potential that this could happen again with this particular site because there are multiple pieces involved. It's not just the FMCSA, the state organizations are involved, your state governments, some of them have different levels of technical proficiency. That is the polite way that I will say that this morning. And a lot of this is going to be done or potentially done manually until they have all the automatic communications back and forth set up to go. So I second Jeremy's notion that if this is something that you are interested in doing, start this process. There's no cost to become a part of the training provider registry and getting your information in there. There will still be some additional steps you'll have to fill out and complete before you can start reporting credit for training done. But, and obviously February 7th, it's not going to allow you to report any training, but it's better to start that process now if that's something that you're considering rather than waiting until the week before.
Jeremy, quick question. If you register with the FMCSA as a training provider provider, do you, and obviously this information has to circulate through the state, and you're doing licensing, let's say New Mexico and Tennessee, do you also have to register with the state licensing agency?
Now, to my understanding, right, you're already going to be registered in the states that you operate in as a company, right? There should be no further registration requirements, i.e. you shouldn't have to send your information into both the TPR and to your state licensing agency or anything like that. That's kind of the purpose of the TPR it is both a housing location for training providers, but it's also a communication system between those training providers, the FMCSA, and the state licensing agencies. So we'll cover this a little bit more later on in the presentation, but when training is completed, the training provider is required to upload all of that information directly to the TPR, and then that information goes from the TPR to the state licensing agencies.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right.
And it applies to both intrastate and interstate commercial drivers.
Yes. So yeah, anyone who has to go through these particular regulations, anybody who doesn't have some sort of rare exemption when it comes to acquiring a CDL or what have you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's say you want to become a registered trainer on the TPR. In order to do that, you must meet one of the two following qualifications. One, you must hold a CDL of the same or higher class and with all endorsements necessary to operate the CMV for which training is to be provided, and have at least 2 years experience driving a CMV requiring a CDL of the same or higher class and or the same endorsement and meet all applicable state qualification requirements for CMV instructors, or 2, you must hold a CDL of the same or higher class and with all endorsements necessary to operate the CMV for which training is to be provided, and have at least 2 years of experience as a behind-the-wheel CMV instructor and meet all applicable state qualification requirements for CMV instructors. Next slide, please. There are, of course, some exceptions to these rules. Number 1, an instructor is not required to hold a CDL of the same or higher class with all endorsements necessary to operate the CMV for which training is to be provided if that instructor previously held a CDL of the same or higher class and complies with all the other requirements set forth in the first or second qualifications. And then number 2 is the important one for us in this discussion, right, is training providers offering online content exclusively are not required to meet state qualification requirements for theory instructors, though it is important to note that they must still meet the other requirements, meaning that all of the training that an online training provider provides must be certified or verified, right, by an individual instructor who meets those qualifications. Also of note is that if an instructor's CDL has been canceled, suspended, or revoked due to any of the disqualifying offenses identified in 383.51 of the CFR, the instructor is prohibited from engaging in theory instruction for 2 years following the date his or her CDL is reinstated. Next slide, please. So let's say you're a driver trainee. You go through all the required motions of entry-level driver training. What happens after you complete your training? Well, once a driver trainee completes the required training for whatever they are attempting to do, the training provider will submit data to the TPR containing the following information. They'll have the driver trainee name, number of driver's license, commercial learner's permit, commercial driver's license as applicable, and then the state of licensure. You'll have the commercial driver's license class and or endorsement and type of training, that being theory and or behind the wheel, the driver trainee completed, right? Then you'll have the total number of clocked hours the driver trainee spent to complete behind the wheel training as applicable. And note for that, right, again, there's not a required amount of time that the FMCSA is wanting for this. But if you're doing behind the wheel training, you do still have to track the number of hours that the driver trainee went through and submit that to the TPR. And then you have to have the name of the training provider and its unique TPR identification number and the dates of the successful training. So this record of completion is sent to the training provider registry, and it is what allows the driver trainee to go take their CDL or endorsement test. Without this proof, right, without this record of completion in the TPR, the driver trainee will not be able to take their CDL or endorsement. And I think that's a very, very big note that some of the people I've had conversations with, it hasn't quite clicked with yet. Come February 7th, if you do not go through this process and you do not have that information submitted to the TPR, and you go and try to get a CDL or endorsement, they will turn you away. You will not be able to acquire the CDL or endorsement that you are trying to obtain. You won't even be able to try to do it.
And again, that's specifically the skills test portion, correct, Jeremy?
Yes. Yeah. So when you go in,
the learner's permit is already been obtained.
So you should already have your CLP before you even initiate this process, right? Because you have to have the CLP to do range or public road training or anything like that, right? But once you have that, you cannot go to the next step. You can't even take your test, your CDL tests, if you do not already have this training submitted to the TPR.
Skills test.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Now we had a question come in, Jeremy, that's pertinent to this. Is there an online template that a TPR registered group would fill out, or is this some template they've got to create on their own?
Oh no. So with the TPR, right? Once you are on the TPR as a training provider registry, they have a basically a form fillable scenario that you fill out to submit information to them. So you're not going to have to make anything up on your own or anything like that. It's going to be, your own internal documentation, or if you're utilizing Infinit-I, right, our internal documentation is going to have to be set up in a specific way, right? But if you are manually putting all of this information into the TPR because you're submitting your own information, then that's just going to be something that you log into the TPR as a training provider registry or training provider, and then you just submit the information each time manually.
Gotcha. No, and I don't think something that we talked about offline is because this is a new system and because we'll find out what's going to break very quickly on this. It's not an instantaneous communication back and forth between the TPR to the state on CDL information. I mean, obviously, when you become a registered training group, there are requirements on how quickly you have to communicate completed training back. Like within a certain window of time frame, you need to be responding back. But we still have a little bit of wait and see to see how quickly that is effectively updated at the TPR, right, and then how quickly that's updated at the state level as well, because it's going to them first and then down to the state.
Absolutely. So if I'm remembering correctly, the FMCSA regulations require training providers to submit their records of completion within 24 hours. It might be 48 hours, but I believe it's within 24 hours. So that is something to note if you're going to be doing your own training, right? You do have to submit this information to the TPR within 24 hours. But as of right now, like you said, we have no idea how smooth this system is going to run for the FMCSA. So I think someone asked, can you schedule a skills test before submitting the training, right? So in theory, potentially you could do that, but right now we don't know if the TPR and the FMCSA are going to have a good handle on this and if this is going to run smoothly, or if it's going to be your best bet to do the TPR, the ELDT stuff, get it submitted to the TPR, and then afterwards schedule your tests, right?
Yeah. In a perfect world, all of the states will have what we call an API set up to communicate automatically, electronically with the TPR. Obviously, in our world with APIs, we know sometimes they break. Sometimes they are not ready at go date, which means that information sent by the TPR to your state is still being handled then manually and has to be entered by someone at the state until they're able to facilitate that electronic communication. So we just don't know. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of states going, we're not going to be ready yet for February 7th to let us know where the problems are going to be. But I would say at least for this initial wave of folks that you may have coming through after February 7th, you probably want to budget additional time into that just to be safe.
And I'll definitely say this, right? Every state is probably going to be different. We're probably going to have some states that February 7th hits and they are ready to go. They're all fired up and this is great. So my recommendation in that situation is just going to be, openly communicate. Call your state licensing association ahead of time, ahead of this February 7th deadline, and see if you can't get a little bit of information from them. They might give you the thumbs up and say, yeah, we're already hooked up, we're ready to go, everything should be just fine. Go ahead and continue scheduling things like you have been, and it'll all be good. Or they might be like, hey, we're working on it, but there might be a few bugs. We recommend you complete your TPR information and then schedule a test afterwards. So that's just going to be my recommendation. Within my assumption is we might see a couple hiccups here or there for some of the states. That seems very likely for me, right? But I would assume within 2 to 6 months, we're probably going to have most of this. Either it's going to be a massive explosion and none of it's going to work, or within 2 to 6 months, we'll have it all ironed out and this will be old hat for everyone relatively soon, would be my assumption.
That's what I think will probably occur. And we did have a question come through, Natalie, just to clarify, if an employee has their permit before February 7th and has not completed the skills test, they will not be required to go through ELDT. And that's the best of mine. If you've got your permit before the 7th, you are on the old rules, not the new rules.
Yep.
So
Absolutely. If you already have your CLP, you are good to go as long as you do not allow that CLP to lapse, right? You're fine. If a driver has their CLP, they just have to go take their skills test and they're good to go.
excellent, excellent, excellent.
Yep.
No, I think this will be very beneficial for some of you out there in terms of a lot of the training you are very capable of doing. You will be doing the sufficient number of hours and can knock out this behind the wheel portion. I mean, when we talk about 19 topics, as you saw from the topics that we're covering in theory content, it's not nuclear science here. We're not reinventing the wheel, as Jeremy mentioned. We're just covering basics that we want to make sure that everyone understands. And so forth. So this is
really
things
the
that you
point,
guys
honestly.
do every single day. So
yeah, that's a very, very good point, and that's something that I really want to reiterate. I said this earlier, but the FMCSA isn't trying to reinvent the wheel here, right? Most of this safety training, good companies are already doing. Most of our driver trainees in the industry are going through this process already and covering the majority of these topics. It's that few bad apples situation that we're trying to avoid, right? A few bad locations or a few bad individuals that we're kind of just skipping the training part of getting a CDL that we're trying to avoid at this point. The FMCSA is trying to establish a level playing field and an easy way for everyone to be doing what they should be doing.
And we did find ourselves in a conversation. This was separate from one of the presentations we had done with a group who is planning on doing its own behind the wheels training. And he firmly believed that he was not responsible for reporting any of the training completed, that he was doing behind the wheel. He is wrong. Everything must be reported. It's like we talk about with the safety training. If it's not signed, if it's not dated, and if you can't find it, it did not happen. And that includes behind the wheel training, that includes theory content training. You want to document your efforts, folks, because you will need to report it, and you will need to report it in a relatively short period of time. I don't know the exact number of hours, but Jeremy was not, it was definitely in the right ballpark. It is shortly after that training is completed that has to be reported to the TPR. It's not something that you can do once a week or every 2 weeks. I mean, this is something that you'll need to stay on top of, and they'll become, very much a habit forming. The forms themselves, unfortunately, can't show you an example of because they are not live yet and won't be until February 7th. But we've gone through the process, or Jeremy has gone through the process rather, to get set up as a TPR registrant just to make sure that nothing came up that was surprising.
Well, as far as like forms go, I can tell you, Craig, this slide that we're sitting on, the form is basically just the information on this slide. It's just listed out in particular, spaces, right? So it's really simple stuff. Again, they're not trying to trick anyone or make this like really crazy for anything. It's just documenting the information.
Gotcha. We had a question come in from Mark specific to the hazmat endorsement. Applications completed, they've paid their fee, they've received their letter, but they can't get the test done until after February 7th. Will they be covered under the old rules or the new rules because it's an endorsement and not a learner's permit?
That one is kind of a sticky wicket. My suggestion there is to contact your state licensing agency about that. As far as I understand, and I've spent a lot of time with these rules, as far as I understand, they're gonna have to do the ELDT. They're gonna have to do the entry-level driver training.
The 13, right? The 13 training courses. Training
exactly, right?
Subjects.
If you do not have your endorsement on the 7th, then you don't have your endorsement on the 7th, and you've got to go through the entry-level driver training. That being said, right, again, I would contact your state licensing agency because they might just say, oh, you qualify, you're fine, don't worry about it, right? So I would double check that because that's definitely in that kind of like gray area of you're already in the process just isn't finalized. And as far as I'm aware, and I've read a lot of the ECFR back and forth and upside down and over again, talk to people, etc. Right? no one has said anything. The FMCSA doesn't have any specific rules about where you are in that process, whether you've started that process or whether you finished that process. All they've really said is, do you have your endorsement? Yes. Great. No? Then do the training. So
That's my understanding.
Awesome. All right, Ed, up in Canada. Hey, Ed, how you doing? It says, is there any impact for newly licensed drivers entering from other countries? Specifically, obviously, Canada and Mexico are the ones we see the most, but I don't think these requirements impact those folks at all.
Yeah, so to my understanding, no, these requirements will not impact drivers from Canada or Mexico in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Those countries have their own requirements for obtaining a CDL, et cetera, for driving a commercial motor vehicle. And there are different requirements governing the ability for a driver to then drive both in Canada and the US, right? So they're still going to have to follow those rules, right? These are not going to affect Canadian or Mexican drivers, probably in any way, shape, form, or fashion, I would imagine.
Gotcha.
It's a good question, though.
Yeah, these are all good questions that we've been receiving. Keep those coming in on chat. To open up chat, if you haven't done so, it's on your menu bar at the top. There's a button that says chat. And if you click on that, it'll bring up a secondary window, and then you can send it. At the very bottom, there's a section that says to, and I would change that to everyone. And that way, everybody who is on the call with us today can see the questions that you're asking, because there may be questions that they have as well. So go ahead and fire that up for you. And before I forget, because I'm old and sometimes that happens, just wanted to throw up a quick question that if you did want us to pass along your details about setting up a demo of the platform so we can have Woody reach out to you, that we can certainly do that and make that happen. And then we also, for anyone who is participating in our webinar today, we do have through our sister company, BetterTruckDrivingJobs.com is offering a free year of job postings through the BetterTruckDrivingJobs.com platform for those folks to take advantage of. And if you'd like to learn more about that, go ahead and respond to that question on the poll as well. But otherwise, we are still here for your questions. So if you have other things that you would like to ask us, fire those off in chat. So,
and I know previously we had kind of discussed, Mark, for example, we'd kind of discussed some frequently asked questions scenarios. So if there's anything that you want to talk about, feel free to jump on stage.
Yeah, Mark, I know you've been having discussions with this behind the scenes with different trucking companies and industry organizations. Is there any scuttlebutt that people on the call with us today should be mindful of?
Yeah, the most common is the clearinghouse explosion on the horizon or not. And of course, we don't have the answer to that, but it certainly appears that on the theory side, that Infinit-I Workforce has a package set up, ready to go for clients. They will submit the information accordingly, and you can invest your time and effort on the skills behind the wheel side. Is that a fair summary?
That is our goal.
That's a pretty fair summary.
Yeah.
That is the goal.
I think this is needed in our industry. I don't think there's anybody questioning that there have been shortcuts taken, and I applaud Jeremy and his staff for I've got to assume thousands, maybe multiple thousands of hours invested to develop all this content, and you have it packaged Class A, Class B, or hazmat, I would assume, in a template, so it's ready to go out. And you also either have or in the process of connecting to the TPR to validate that completion is submitted. And of course, the clients can have their own certificate of completion just in case it blows up. And one of the questions is, can you schedule? I'm going to presume there will be no scheduled skill testing until there is a valid completion of ELDT in the system for your state.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work out, and it might end up depending on each different state, but my assumption is probably going to be when you go to schedule things, they're going to check, is your information here? No? Then you can't schedule.
Or even or you can't even schedule. So yes,
Yeah.
I agree with that. And the content will be similar to the other 850, what you send out 300,000 a month content, which is short, 5 to 10 minutes, followed by questions that are appropriate, up to 5 to 10, I would assume. Is that the general format?
That's correct.
That's the general format that we try to keep, though I will note specifically for entry-level driver training, right, some of the topics that are required to be covered by the FMCSA are a bit more robust in some of the scopes that they want covered. So our format tries to stick to that, to the 5 to 10 minute scenario. You'll find a couple of outliers here or there when we ran into topics where we just felt this can't be covered in 2 shorter videos or 3 shorter videos. This is very pertinent information to itself. It needs to stay together, basically. So you might find the occasional 12 or 14-minute video, but what we completely avoid as much as possible is the scenario where it's a 20 or 30-minute video, because no one's going to retain that information.
Or an hour, yeah.
No, I agree. And having to take a quiz after you've watched a 30-minute video, you're not going to remember what you watched at the beginning of that video by the time you get to the end of it. So a couple additional questions have come in while we've been chatting. And Mark, this one's from your good friend Andy out there in Sulphur Springs.
Hello, Andrea.
Can you just enroll in ELDT courses only? I mean, you can. They will be part of the library that's in the system that's available to everyone that works with us. So you can even assign out parts of the ELD training to non-driving staff if you want to. That was actually something that Mark and Jeremy and I talked about before the call, is that this isn't necessarily a bad thing to spread this information around to people that won't sit for the CDL test, because it is good information for them to know about the safe operation of a vehicle. Things that drivers should be doing to maintain equipment, to be doing the right thing on the road. I mean, that's not bad for dispatchers to know, operations to know, maintenance to know, so they understand what the drivers are being trained on. So that is absolutely something you can do. That will not be, I guess, Jeremy, if they're just kind of picking and choosing the ELDT content, that won't necessarily be something that we report over unless they did manage to complete all of it.
So whenever, as far as reporting goes, right, we will only report on information that has been submitted to us, right? Because there's specific information that we normally don't require that is required by the FMCSA for the training provider registry. So we'll specifically require that information for individuals that a company wants us to submit that information for. So also, just to kind of like circle back on that question, if it's coming from a different angle, i.e. if it's coming from the can you purchase just ELDT from Infinit-I rather than actually all of the rest of the services that Infinit-I provides, I don't have the specifics on that. I'm not sales, but I do believe we are planning to offer that
an option for that.
Yeah, so we are going to be offering that individually, to where you can purchase, you know, I need to train my drivers for Class A CDL, right? So I'm just going to purchase the theory instruction for that period. So I do believe that is something that we are working towards.
That's correct. That is correct. But for those of you who already are contracted with us, we're adding the ELDT content actually
at no additional cost.
It's no additional cost. A big chunk of it is already there and has been there since you started working with us. You just may not have known it because a lot of that content we have repurposed and updated over time, coupling, uncoupling, pre-trip, post-trip. We've multiple modules in that section and so forth. So those things are already there to take advantage of. We're just expanding upon it to make sure that we have everything covered that they want. So you had another question. How does this affect trucking companies? If you are only hiring driver applicants that have attained their CDL, the ELDT training is not something you have to worry about. So
absolutely right. So the trucking industry, and Mark can attest to this, the trucking industry is such a diverse industry. There's all different types of companies that have all different kinds of hiring practices. If you are with a company that only hires individuals that already have all of the qualifications that you need them to have, they already have their CDL, they already have all the endorsements that you need for them, then this affects you zero. this will not affect you in any way, shape, form, or fashion unless you are dealing with driver trainees that need to acquire their CDL or need to acquire an endorsement. So.
Excellent. And then if we want to use the Infinit-I training program, do we still have to register as a training provider? Not for theory content. We are already a registered training provider for that. But for the behind the wheel training and skills test, you would need to be registered as your own entity, because that's the one piece. We're not sending Jeremy out to your depot to watch your guys drive or teach your guys how to drive. He's got his hands covered, so he's busy enough. But that would be the only situation, is if you wanted to then do that behind the wheel training and not necessarily. There are third parties out there that also facilitate that behind the wheel training and skills test. So it's not a requirement that you become a TPR registered provider, but it is certainly an option. And that's one of the things that we wanted to share today, is that, one, we have this theory content piece locked up for you. So if you already work with us, you're good to go. If you want to work with us, let's talk more and we can get you good to go. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A quick Google search of your local area is going to find you a behind the wheel training provider. I can guarantee that, right? So.
Excellent. All right. Well, everyone, we are at our time today. We appreciate you joining us. If you have any additional questions for Mr. Jeremy, there are his contact information, his details, so that you can reach out to him privately so he can respond to you with the answers that you need. Otherwise, Jeremy, thank you for joining us today. This was very helpful, very informative. Mark's always a pleasure to see you, sir. And we're back at it again in 2022. And everyone else out there on the call with us, thank you for joining us, and be safe out there, everybody. We appreciate you.
February 7th.
February 7th.